In 2012, at the South Gippsland town of Foster, population 1,600, a medical clinic for young people aged 10 to 25 opened its doors. An average 10 to 12 students per session drop in to see an adolescent health nurse and general practitioner. The Australian of the Year in 2010, Professor Pat McGorry, is a clinician and researcher on youth mental health, and he spoke with clinic staff about the need.
Well, the mental health of young people is the greatest challenge facing developed and developing countries in terms of health. And the reason for that is contained in a paper that was written in Nature a couple of years ago, which points out that the mental wealth of nations, or the social value, social capital in society, is dependent on the young people making a successful transition from childhood to adulthood. Societies invest a huge amount in young people making that transition, getting them to the threshold of productive life. And if they become ill or break down or even don't fulfill their potential, then that's not just a human cost, but it's also a massive sort of social and economic cost to society. And yet, all around the world, there's been tremendous neglect of the health and social needs of young people making this transition, as every family member would know in the community. And that's obviously affecting Australia in just the same way as any other country. And fortunately, in recent years, Australia has begun to recognise this as a major issue.
General health issues form 10% of the reasons for visiting the clinic, 30% for sexual health issues, and 60% are for mental health, predominantly anxiety and depression. The clinic staff asked Professor McGorry about overcoming the obstacles to pioneering such a service in rural areas.
When it comes to regional and rural parts of Australia, I've seen communities transformed by addressing this issue. People would say before an attempt was made to help the young people with mental health problems that it couldn't be done. Rural people are too inward, they're not able to open up about family problems and mental health issues, and that stigma would be a major barrier. But in actual fact, the best successes we've seen in Headspace in any part of Australia have happened in rural and regional areas where the whole community has got behind the initiative. They realise it's not a matter of shame or stigma, it's a matter of supporting young people making this difficult transition to adult life, and that mental ill health is to be expected during this transition. In almost every family, there's someone with mental ill health, and as I said earlier, 50% of young people will experience some type of mental ill health during the transition. Some of it's serious, but most of it fairly transient that will actually resolve in a good way with the right type of help and support. So I think it's a very good news story for rural and regional Australia. And the first thing is to take the initial step, the first step in setting up the approach. And you have done that in Foster and in South Gippsland by setting up the Youth Assist Clinic. I've heard stories from that clinic already today, very promising stories. It needs a lot more support in terms of professional time, and also support for developing that stigma-free, that youth-friendly environment, but also an environment that welcomes families, because parents of kids who are struggling with these issues are frantic. They don't know where to turn to for help. They think they're the only ones affected by it. They feel they can't talk to people about it, and then life is very difficult for them. And they put so much energy and support into their children and their children's development. Their children are the most important things to them as parents in their lives. But when things start to go off the rails, they really don't have anywhere to turn to. So a clinic like this has to be inclusive, not just of young people and the youth-friendly approach and the respecting the individual development of the young people and the trust that goes with that, confidentiality, but also welcoming families to be the key scaffolding in supporting those young people in making the transition to adult life. And these problems it's not rocket science. We don't have to develop a brilliant new drug discovery or a new gene discovery to actually improve outcomes here. We already have the knowledge and expertise. What's missing is the political and community will to do it.
South Gippsland Hospital auspices the Youth Assist Clinic, providing project management and clinical governance. An administrative committee made up of hospital staff, community members and young people guides the ongoing development of this service.
Just some facts and figures about this. 75% of mental ill health will have appeared by the age of 25, most of it in the period from puberty through to the mid-20s. And yet that's the weakest part of our health system. Most of the resources that we spend on health are in younger children or in people over 50. And the young people who are physically healthy mostly these days don't get their main health issue addressed, which is mental ill health and drugs and alcohol issues. Those are the major threats to their health and well-being, as every family member will know from first-hand experience, or either through their own kids or through their friends, the friends of their kids. So it's a bit of a sleeping giant, actually, in most communities. 50% of young people will experience a period of mental ill health during this transition to adulthood between the ages of 12 and 25. 50%. Now, some people will say, well, that just means it's normal, it's just part of the human condition, people should just suck it up. But actually, it's got practical consequences. If we ignore it and treat it in that way, then young people will die, they'll become disabled, and they won't fulfill their potential. So it doesn't make sense to just sweep it under the carpet like we have been doing. The reason people have swept it under the carpet is because they have been confused about what to do. There haven't been obvious solutions, and there's a sense of shame or even guilt about what is happening to the young people. And naturally, the young people themselves, they may not realise what's happening and how help might be able to be obtained.
The adolescent health nurse is the first port of call when students drop into the clinic. Trust and rapport have been slowly built, and the numbers are growing.
The Youth Access Clinic is a place where young people can come and get help and support. It's just a safe place for them, a safe, friendly space where they can access help for their healthcare needs and any other needs or concerns that they have.
Following the initial assessment, further services are offered: consultation with the doctor, assessment with a mental health care nurse, or referral to secondary services such as psychologists, welfare workers, or drug and alcohol workers.
Youth need to know that their concerns are being heard. Youth with high-risk presentations are supported to include parents as part of the recovery process.
Professor McGorry speaks on the most serious issue of all.
One of the big myths that's been around for a long time, which is starting to break up at last, is the idea that it's not okay to talk about suicide. Now, suicide is the biggest killer of young Australians up to the age of even 35 or 40, and kills many hundreds in this age group every year around Australia, especially in rural and regional areas, high risk. And 2,500 Australians die every year from suicide. Yet most people aren't aware that it's a 40% bigger issue than the road toll. And why is that? It's because it's been surrounded by a taboo, by a sense of shame and stigma. And if a suicide does occur in the community, it's covered up. The media are discouraged from reporting it in the mistaken belief that somehow that's going to reduce the risk of other people killing themselves. I think that if we now know that if suicide is reported responsibly and honestly, that actually it's more likely that suicide risk will go down rather than be increased. We saw this recently in the Albury-Wodonga area through the campaign of the Border Mail newspaper, which carried prominent stories about suicide and the risks associated with it that cause it for about a 6-week period. And they won a Walkley Award for journalism for doing this. So the Press Council has liberalised its reporting approach and guidelines. And people are being encouraged now to talk much more openly about it, including holding public community meetings of support for people who have been bereaved, and to actually identify those at risk in the community and provide more support for them. So I think we're seeing a bit of a watershed here, which is particularly important in rural and regional parts of Australia because the risks are greater. And obviously, when we talk about suicide, what we're trying to find is people who are struggling, people who are really experiencing poor mental health, mental ill health, And this often goes on for a long time before the suicide attempt actually does occur. So again, the good news is there's usually an opportunity to help that person well before they get to the stage of being desperate in this way. So what we have to do is get over our sense of taboo and shame and stigma and fear of talking about it, and reach out to those who might be struggling and give them some options. And this is why we need some professional services that are able to respond in a proactive way and not just be put on a waiting list for 6 months, during which it can be quite a risky period. And also to get the support of the community and the family and friends around them to help them see there is a future. Suicide tragically often takes people who would have been able to recover within a fairly short space of time and be able to get back on with their lives, and they'll never have the opportunity to do that because of the fact that the transient experience of suicidal risk actually caused their death. So suicide prevention is very possible. Most deaths from suicide are preventable, but we have to really start talking about it.
This clinic is unique because it offers young people a casual drop-in service that is safe and highly professional. Our major sponsor, the Foster and Tura Community Bank, have been incredibly enthusiastic and supportive. They were prepared to back us before we even opened our doors.